Hello. In this video, I'll be sharing some LNAT essay tips. The LNAT is the National Admissions Test for Law, and I'm one of the authors of the Complete LNAT guide. I'm doing this video improvising without a script. I just hope that it can help some of you if you are taking the upcoming LNAT examinations. Let's consider this question. In a Western society, arranged marriages should no longer be tolerated. Discuss. This is the first question in the second official LNAT practice paper that you can download from their website. Okay, now given a question like this, most candidates can come up with some reasonably reasonable points. For example, you might argue that arranged marriages should not be tolerated as they undermine personal autonomy and choice. Or you might argue arranged marriages should not be tolerated, arranged marriage, as it is an outdated institution. Or you might argue that statistically speaking, arranged marriages have been very successful, okay, and that the success of a marriage is based on commitment and compatibility rather than how the couple met. Okay, so we should tolerate it. Okay, now these are all very interesting points. I mean, they are reasonable points. Most candidates will be able to come up with 3 reasonable points. There are many other points you could come up with. And they will be able to structure the essay reasonably well and write it with a good command of English. The question is, how do you make yourself stand out from all these candidates? And I think one of the ways is the way you look at the question, how you frame the question. Okay, what do I mean by that? Now, look at this essay question. What do you think the underlying tension in this question is? It could be, for example, autonomy versus lack of autonomy. Okay, so we might argue that in arranged marriages there's a lack of autonomy because there's no personal choice. Whereas in other kinds of marriages, maybe a marriage for love, let's call them love marriages. In those marriages, there'll be autonomy. You can choose who you are dating. You can choose who you get married to. Okay, and that, or you might identify the underlying tension as Western ideals versus departure from Western ideals. So the idea here would then be something along the lines of arranged marriages are a departure from Western ideals. Western ideals, we want love marriages. For example, okay, I'm just giving examples here. Now, you might be wondering, what's the difference here? Am I not just writing the same thing like twice because they seem like similar things, right? Maybe Western ideals involve autonomy as well and all that. They are actually very different things. If your analysis is going to be if you frame your essay and look at it from the second point of view, then how you argue it is whether arranged marriages should or should not be tolerated based on whether they are a departure from Western ideals. The actual merit of arranged marriages itself is completely irrelevant. Okay, it's completely irrelevant. So if you are arguing from like the second perspective, so the second way of framing it, you wouldn't be arguing how arranged marriages are good for whatever reasons, because that's irrelevant. Arranged marriages could be Western marriages, like Western love marriages, could be the worst thing ever. And you could still argue that we shouldn't depart from it because we want a cohesive society with a unified culture, something like that. So if that's your line of argument, then it's completely different from arguing for or against the merits of arranged marriages, which is like the first kind of argument. I'll let you consider a paragraph that one of my students wrote to show you an example. Okay, this is the paragraph. You can pause the video if you want to look at it. Okay. Now, in the first part of the paragraph, we can see that there are arguments mounted that arranged marriages should not be accepted as they undermine the principle of personal autonomy. Okay. Personal autonomy is closely linked to, okay, you see, right? The question is in a Western society. So if you're talking about personal autonomy, then I'm wondering how this is linked to Western society. Okay. because personal autonomy is universal, right? It doesn't matter whether you're Eastern, Western, Northern, or Southern, it is applicable. Personal autonomy is linked to human dignity, undermining it is stripping away a person's dignity, which is unacceptable. Okay. Ideal autonomy is tied to individualism, blah, 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 blah. So all this is explaining the merits or the lack of merit of arranged marriages. It's saying, oh, arranged marriages are bad because they um take away our dignity, take away our autonomy and all that. And then after that, the paragraph seems to flow perfectly, but from an argument point of view, it's actually flip-flopping between two very different perspectives. You see, right? Over here now it's talking about ultimately ideals such as the American dream, which emphasize self-determination and individual aspiration, will be weakened if such practices were left unchallenged. Here is the second kind of framing already. He's saying that he's arguing that arranged marriages will be a departure from Western ideals. Okay, and here as well, for example, from this perspective, it's understandable that Western societies would view forced partner selection as unacceptable, especially when emotional incompatibility is ignored. So here there's some here the writer is implying that emotional incompatibility may be a Western ideal that we are departing from. So this is an example of a paragraph that lacks focus because it is arguing along two different directions. Both frames are equally valid, by the way. Now, for example, if we are arguing, okay, if we say the core tension is autonomy versus lack of autonomy, or whatever other, you might have any other principles in mind when you think about arranged marriages versus non-arranged marriages. I'm just giving examples. It could be like consent versus lack of consent, or whatever other core underlying tensions you might want to discuss. Okay, but let's look at this. Now you might be wondering, if we use this to be the focus of the essay, then what's the relevance of the words in a Western society? Because whether you're in a Western society or any other society, autonomy is autonomy, right? And we want autonomy in any society, right? Well, if you interpret it this way, then in a then that means that the words in a Western society simply gives you the context for discussion. So what that means is that you are answering the question by saying arranged marriages should no longer be tolerated in Western society. And then somebody might come along and ask you, oh really? Then what about Eastern society? Should it be tolerated in Eastern society then, or any other society? And you might say to them, and you will answer them, it should also not be tolerated in any other society. But my essay is confined to the context of in a Western society. It doesn't mean that I think they should be tolerated in any other society. It just means that my essay is talking about in a Western society, they shouldn't be tolerated, and I'm giving example. So the Western society part is simply giving us the context for the question. So we are going to draw examples from a Western society. Now this is very different from the second way of approaching the question. In this way of approaching the question, in a Western society is going to be contrasted with other kinds of society. You are going to be saying arranged marriages should no longer be tolerated in a Western society, even if they are tolerated elsewhere. So here will be, it should also. So do you see the difference? The difference is that the first way of interpreting it, the Western society part gives the context. That's all. It gives the society from which you're going to give examples. And it doesn't mean that you're contrasting it with other societies and saying that other societies, it should be tolerated. But in the second way of interpreting the question, it actually becomes significant. You are saying that arranged marriages should no longer be tolerated in a Western society because of certain things that are specific to a Western society, even if it's okay for them to be tolerated elsewhere. Okay? And then you're going to be like contrasting the differences between them. That kind of idea. So I think that such framing mistakes are quite common. Let me give some other examples. Let me give another example, okay? Let's consider the question. Let's consider this question. Government should place strict limits on the influence of private companies in shaping public opinion. Discuss. Okay, then let's consider a paragraph like this. Okay, again, you can pause your video to read the paragraph. If you are done, okay. The paragraph seems to flow seamlessly, okay? If you are just writing without like this concepts in mind about identifying the underlying core tensions about framing of an essay, you would think this paragraph seems to work perfectly, right? Let's look at the paragraph, okay? First is the topic sentence. Government should place strict limits on the influence of private companies in shaping public opinion. Why? Because they have disproportionate control over the flow of information in modern society. Okay, so what? Okay, it says that large tech firms can determine what content is seen, blah blah blah. Such control, okay, this part is important. Such control raises concerns about democratic accountability since these companies exercise politically significant influence without public mandate or meaningful oversight. Okay. Okay, so the first issue here is that, okay, let's talk about framing of this question, okay? The first part here is about democratic accountability. So it is in terms of framing, the first way you can look at this question is who should have power to shape public opinion? Okay, and one way to answer who should have power to shape public opinion is the government and not private companies. Why? Because private companies lack a public mandate. Lack a public mandate meaning they are not like elected, unlike the government. They are not elected, democratically elected by the people, and lack meaningful oversight. I'm using the words from this paragraph, by the way. So private companies are not democratically accountable. They lack a public mandate. They lack meaningful oversight. Okay, they can do whatever they want, in other words, as long as it's not illegal. Whereas governments, when they shape public opinion in certain ways, they are accountable to the public. If they do it in a bad way, they're going to lose votes at the next election. So this is the first way to frame it. And when you frame it in this way, this is one of the ways you can answer this frame. You can say, who should have power? Well, the government should have power. Of course, you can say other entities should have power. You can raise any of the many other arguments. The second way we can frame and answer this question, and it will be completely different from the first frame, is do private companies shape public opinion in a negative way? Now, so look at the question. The question is, government should place strict limits on the influence of private companies in shaping public opinion. So if you look at it the first way, you are interpreting it as, oh, government, maybe government should be the one to shape public opinion, maybe not private companies. So the question here is, who should shape public opinion, right? But if you look at it the second way, it is a completely different perspective. The perspective here now is, do private companies shape public opinions in a negative way such that we want governments to step in to place strict limits on them? So if we look at it from this way, then we are going to be analyzing the question from a completely different point of view. We are going to be arguing, oh yes, they shape public opinion in a negative way because they do blah blah blah, or no, they do not shape it in a negative way because they do blah 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 blah. Okay, it's completely different from the first one, because the first one is about who has the power to shape public opinion, whether positive or negative. That's not important. The important thing is who should have power. But the second one is whether the shaping of private companies is negative or positive. Okay, there are other ways you can frame a question as well. For example, another valid way to frame this question would be to consider who should be placing limits. Okay, now if you look at this, you might think, isn't this the same as the first one? Who should have the power? Isn't this the same as the first one? Who should be placing limits? But it's not the same. Okay. The reason it's not the same is because the first one is concerned with who should have the power. But even after you determine who should have the power, the third question is concerned with who should be placing the limits. Should governments be the one who is placing strict limits on the influence of private companies? Or maybe we should leave it up to the public to to place limits via social pressure, you know, via reputational backlash if they keep spreading misinformation. So the question here is, should the government be the one placing strict limits? Should the government be the entity placing strict limits on the influence of private companies? Should it be the government, or should it just be left up to the public, or should there be other private bodies that should regulate these private bodies? You know, who should be placing the limits? What? So the first point here is concerned with how should the power be distributed, and the third way of framing here is concerned with, given the way we have decided power should be distributed, who should be the enforcers? Who should place the limits? Okay, and every single way of interpreting the question is equally valid. Okay, these are very different perspectives that you can frame the question from. The key is not to flip-flop between them unknowingly in your argument. Like when you're arguing a paragraph and then you're going back and forth, and you don't even understand that, like, the lack of conceptual clarity in your mind is very obvious when you are doing that. Okay, let's go back to this paragraph. Okay, you see the first part is talking about democratic accountability. Okay, this part is great. So we are answering who should have the power to shape public opinion. We are saying governments probably should have the power because these tech companies, they don't have public mandate, they lack meaningful oversight. Okay, and then here it flows seamlessly. It seems to flow seamlessly, but it doesn't. Citizens may unknowingly form opinions based on curated or manipulated information environments. Such curation or manipulation is common, as tech firms curate and manipulate content to drive engagement for profit, often promoting sensational or emotionally charged material. This can be harmful, as over time this can contribute to skewed public opinion on important issues. If you read this paragraph as a whole like that, without the framing in mind, it would seem to flow perfectly well. But actually the entire focus of the argument has shifted already. Now, this is arguing the second way of framing it, which is that private companies are shaping public opinion in a negative way because they are doing sensational and emotionally charged material, which is harmful to the people. Okay, so from democratic accountability, we have moved to it being harmful to the people. And why do I say they are very different frames? The reason they are very different lines of argument is that if we say that the government or whoever should have the power, then what they do with the power is a separate question from whether they should have the power in the first place. Okay, and this first part is concerned with who should have the power. This second part is concerned with, is there an abuse of the power? It's completely different. As a result, government should step in place to place strict limits on the influence of private companies rather than leaving. This is even worse. This linking last line seems to be going in a third different direction. So, like, all this is just an example. Many students make mistakes like this and they don't even realize it's happening because to them the paragraph makes perfect sense. Okay, I'm going to give one final example. I'm going to give one final example. Okay, my third example will be this. In this final example, I'm not only going to talk about frame, I'm going to talk about the lenses within the frames that we can use to look at an essay. Okay, like look at this question social media companies should be legally responsible for all content posted on their platforms discussed. Okay, there are a lot of possible frames and ways you can look at this, but let's just consider two. The first one is, who should be responsible for the content? Should it be social media companies? Should it be the users who post the content? Should it be the government? Should it be whoever? Okay. The second way to look at it would be, why should social company media companies be legally responsible? So this is a different question from the first one, because when you look at it the second way like this, you are going to even if social media companies are responsible, the question is whether the law should step in. Should they be legally responsible? Okay. Now, given questions like this, there are a lot of possible lenses from which you can look at each frame. For example, okay, let me give some examples, okay? And I'm going to give some very simplistic arguments just so you can understand what I'm talking about. For example, from a moral lens, we might argue that perhaps producer of the content is the one producing the harm and is therefore should be responsible. So you can see that this is an argument that belongs here. It doesn't belong here because the emphasis here is on whether they should be legally responsible. Or you can look at it from a more practical lens. You can analyze it like, for example, social media companies are in the best position to edit or regulate content. Okay. So if you look at it from a practical lens, you can see that it's very different from a moral argument, right? From a practical lens, we don't really care whether morally it should be right to make you responsible, but from a practical point of view, you are in the best position to do it, so you're responsible. Okay. Or maybe you might look at it from a philosophical perspective, philosophical lens. We might say, what is the true nature of responsibility? When we look at this, we are going to be thinking about, it's going to be a discussion about free will versus determinism. It's going to be a discussion about agency of humans as rational beings and intent and the role of intention, things like that. Okay, a philosophical discussion. Now, if you look at the second frame, it's going to be very different. We can use the same lenses, but it's going to be different arguments. Okay, for example, a moral lens for the second perspective might be something like, what moral purpose, if any, should the law serve? Like, why do we want the law to step in? Whether or not they are responsible, why do we want the law to step in? Or practical lens might be something like, how does the law guide actions? Would holding them legally responsible generate the outcomes we want? Okay, or maybe like philosophically, philosophical lens, we might say, what justifies the use of the law, right? Because when you use the law, it means that if you go against the law, there are penalties, right? So what justifies state coercion? In other words, why should we hold them legally responsible? Why not just hold them morally responsible? Why not hold them socially responsible? You know, why does law, for example, like adultery in most countries, cheating on your spouse is morally wrong, and people who, I mean, in most countries, people will see it as morally wrong. So like the people who participate in adultery, cheating on their spouse, they will be morally responsible, but they're not legally responsible because in most countries it is not against the law to do that. So the question here for social media companies is, why should they be legally responsible, right? And so I guess the takeaway from this lesson, okay, consider another very simple question, okay? Like, abortion should be made illegal. Let's not discuss. Very, very simple question, okay? And you can come up with a lot of different points in your mind, right? But if you don't really understand what the core tensions they are going for, and if you don't really understand what kind of lenses you are trying to argue for, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have 3 points in your essay, and the 3 points are going to be randomly drawn from different frames and different lenses, and it won't form a cohesive whole at all. It'll just be all over the place. You won't even it will just be 3 random. So if I flesh out the entire framework for abortion, giving all the different frames and giving all the different lenses, it will just be 3 random points from random frames and random lenses, like just thrown together in one essay with no conceptual focus that ties them together. And that's what I want to share today, which is this idea that you have to be more aware of uh, how you grapple with a question, how you control the difficulties in the question, and how you uh, give it focus by identifying the core tensions you're going to be focusing on, and then going in a unified direction in a coherent way for your entire essay, not like flip-flopping constantly back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And most people don't even realize they're doing that. Yeah, I think that's the end of it. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or anything, you can always reach us at, I think this is my, you can always reach us at my email address. I'll leave it in the link below. Thank you.